The world is once again holding its breath as United States warships move closer to Iranian waters, triggering global fears of a major military escalation in the Middle East. From Washington to Beijing, from Moscow to European capitals, diplomats, analysts, and ordinary citizens are asking the same dangerous question. Is the world standing on the edge of another war? The movement of U.S. naval power near Iran is not just a routine show of force. It is a signal, a warning, and potentially the opening chapter of a conflict that could reshape the entire region. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Iran has been defined by mistrust, sanctions, covert operations, and proxy battles. Every time American warships appear near the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz, alarms ring across global markets and military command centers. This time, however, the situation feels different. The timing, the scale, and the political context suggest that something far more serious may be unfolding behind closed doors. At the center of this tension is geography. The Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz are among the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow maritime corridor. Any military confrontation here would not remain a regional issue. It would instantly become a global economic crisis. The presence of U.S. warships so close to Iran sends a powerful message. America is prepared to protect its interests, no matter the risk. Iran, on the other hand, sees these warships not as defensive tools, but as direct threats to its sovereignty. Iranian leaders have repeatedly warned that any foreign military presence near their shores is unacceptable. Over the years, Iran has developed a military doctrine centered on asymmetric warfare. Fast attack boats, naval mines, drones, and missiles designed specifically to counter superior U.S. naval forces. This makes the situation even more dangerous, as even a small miscalculation could spiral into open conflict. The buildup did not happen overnight. In recent weeks, tensions between Iran and the West have been steadily rising. Accusations over Iran's nuclear program, clashes involving Iranian-backed groups across the Middle East, and attacks on commercial shipping have all added fuel to an already volatile situation. Each incident on its own might have been manageable. Together, they form a chain reaction, pushing both sides closer to confrontation. From Washington's perspective, deploying warships near Iran serves multiple purposes. It reassures U.S. allies in the region, including Gulf states that rely heavily on American security guarantees. It also acts as a deterrent, signaling to Tehran that any aggressive move will be met with overwhelming force. U.S. officials insist that the deployment is defensive, aimed at maintaining freedom of navigation and preventing attacks on international shipping lanes. But deterrence is a double-edged sword. History shows that military posturing can sometimes provoke the very actions it is meant to prevent. Iran may interpret the arrival of U.S. warships as preparation for an attack, pushing it to raise its own military readiness. In such a tense environment, radar blips, drone flights, or warning shots can quickly turn into deadly engagements. The international community is deeply divided on how to respond. European nations are urging restraint, calling for diplomatic solutions and back-channel negotiations. China and Russia have criticized the U.S. military presence, arguing that it destabilizes the region and increases the risk of war. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern countries find themselves caught in the middle, fearing that any conflict between the U.S. and Iran would spill across borders and devastate their economies. Inside Iran, state media portrays the U.S. warships as symbols of American aggression and imperialism. Iranian commanders boast of their ability to strike U.S. vessels if necessary, showcasing missile tests and naval exercises as proof of readiness. This public rhetoric serves two purposes. It strengthens domestic unity and warns foreign powers not to underestimate Iranian capabilities. In the United States, political pressures are also shaping events. American leaders must balance the desire to appear strong with the public fatigue from endless wars in the Middle East. A full-scale conflict with Iran would be costly, unpredictable, and politically risky. Yet backing down too easily could be seen as weakness, both at home and abroad. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the lack of trust between the two sides. Diplomatic channels are limited, misunderstandings are common, and each side assumes the worst intentions from the other. In such an atmosphere, even routine military maneuvers can be misinterpreted as preparations for attack. The margin for error is frighteningly small. Global markets are already reacting. Oil prices fluctuate with every new headline. Investors grow nervous, and shipping companies reroute vessels to avoid potential danger zones. The economic impact of a conflict would not wait for the first missile to be fired. It is already being felt in subtle but significant ways. As U.S. warships patrol closer to Iran, the world watches nervously. Will this show of force succeed in deterring conflict, or will it push the region closer to war? Are back-channel talks quietly working to diffuse tensions, or are leaders on both sides preparing for the worst? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing is clear. The situation is more fragile than it appears. This moment is not just about military power. It is about perception, fear, and the dangerous psychology of escalation. When nations armed with advanced weapons face each other at close range, peace can collapse in seconds. The coming days and weeks will be critical, as every decision, every signal, and every movement at sea could determine whether this crisis ends in diplomacy or disaster. For now, the U.S. warships remain in position. Iran remains defiant, and the world remains on edge, waiting to see who will blink first. As U.S. warships tighten their operational presence near Iran, the crisis enters a far more complex and dangerous phase, one shaped not just by military hardware, but by history, strategy, and psychological pressure. To understand why the world fears escalation now more than ever, it is essential to examine what both sides believe is at stake and how past confrontations are influencing present decisions. For Iran, this moment is not isolated. It is part of a long narrative of confrontation with the United States that stretches back decades. From sanctions that crippled its economy to covert operations and regional power struggles, Tehran views Washington's actions through a lens of survival. The presence of American warships so close to Iranian waters is seen as a reminder that the U.S. still holds overwhelming military power and is willing to use it if necessary. This perception fuels Iran's determination to resist pressure rather than submit to it. Iran-AS military strategy is built around one core assumption: it cannot win a conventional war against the United States. Instead, it has invested heavily in asymmetric tactics designed to make any conflict painful, prolonged, and politically costly for its adversaries. Fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, drones, cyber capabilities, and proxy forces across the Middle East form a web of deterrence. U.S. warships may dominate the seas, but Iran believes it can turn narrow waterways and regional instability into powerful weapons. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the heart of this strategy. This narrow passage is Iran's most potent leverage point. Even the threat of disruption here is enough to send shockwaves through global energy markets. Iran has repeatedly hinted that if pushed too far, it could make the strait unsafe for commercial shipping. While completely closing it would invite massive retaliation, limited disruptions or harassment operations could still achieve strategic goals without crossing a clear red line. From the American perspective, allowing Iran to threaten international waterways is unacceptable. The U.S. Navy AS mission in the region goes beyond Iran. It is about maintaining the credibility of global trade routes and international norms. If Iran were allowed to intimidate shipping without consequence, it would signal weakness not just to Tehran, but to rival powers watching closely from afar. This is where escalation becomes most dangerous. Both sides believe they are acting defensively. The United States sees its warships as stabilizing forces meant to deter aggression. Iran sees those same ships as offensive threats meant to coerce submission. When both sides frame their actions as defensive, compromise becomes harder, and miscalculation becomes more likely. Another critical factor, driving fear, is the role of regional allies and proxy groups. Iran does not stand alone. Across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, groups aligned with Tehran possess rockets, drones, and missiles capable of striking U.S. interests and allies. Any confrontation at sea could quickly expand into a multi-front crisis across the Middle East. This would stretch U.S. forces and drag regional states into a conflict they desperately want to avoid. At the same time, U.S. allies in the region are nervous. Gulf states rely on American naval power for protection, but they also know they would be among the first targets in any wider conflict. Oil facilities, ports, and cities could be drawn into the crossfire. These countries walk a delicate line, welcoming U.S. protection while quietly urging restraint to avoid becoming battlegrounds. Global powers are also calculating their moves carefully. Russia sees the crisis as another opportunity to challenge U.S. influence and present itself as a counterweight to American power. China, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy supplies, fears any disruption that could harm its economy. Both countries publicly call for de-escalation, but privately they watch closely, analyzing how the U.S. handles confrontation and whether its deterrence still holds. Inside Washington, the debate is intense. Military commanders prioritize readiness and deterrence, arguing that weakness invites aggression. Diplomats warn that military pressure without clear off-ramps increases the risk of war. Political leaders must weigh national security against domestic opinion, which remains deeply wary of another Middle Eastern conflict. Every decision is scrutinized not only for its immediate impact, but for how it will be perceived by allies, rivals, and voters. Iran faces its own internal pressures. Economic hardship caused by sanctions has increased public frustration, yet external threats often rally domestic support around the government. Iranian leaders know that backing down under pressure could be seen as surrender, weakening their authority at home. At the same time, they understand that a full-scale war could be devastating. This tension pushes Iran toward calculated risk-taking rather than outright confrontation. One of the most alarming aspects of the current situation is the speed at which events could unfold. Modern warfare allows little time for reflection. Drones move faster than diplomacy. Missiles travel faster than phone calls. In such an environment, a single incident, an intercepted drone, a warning shot, a collision at sea, could trigger a rapid escalation before leaders have time to intervene. Communication channels between the US and Iran are limited and fragile. Without direct, reliable lines of contact, misunderstandings can spiral out of control. History offers sobering examples of how conflicts begin not with deliberate decisions, but with accidents misread as intentions. The fear gripping the world today is rooted in this reality, that war might not start because someone wants it, but because no one stops it in time. Media coverage and political rhetoric further complicate the situation. Strong words are often used for domestic audiences, but once spoken, they create expectations. Leaders who publicly threaten retaliation may feel trapped by their own statements, forced to act to preserve credibility. This dynamic turns language into another weapon, one that can lock nations into dangerous paths. As U.S. warships continue their patrols, the crisis feels less like a single event and more like a slow-moving storm. Each side tests limits, probes reactions, and signals resolve. The problem is that signals can be misread. What one side considers a warning, the other may see as provocation. The world fears escalation not because war is inevitable, but because the system designed to prevent it is under extreme strain. Trust is low, communication is weak, and stakes are extraordinarily high. In such conditions, peace depends not just on strength, but on restraint, and restraint is often the first casualty of fear. As the tension builds, one question dominates global thinking. Will cooler heads prevail before a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed? Or will this standoff near Iran become the spark that ignites a wider conflict, reshaping the Middle East and the world beyond it? As the standoff between U.S. warships and Iran deepens, attention shifts from immediate military movements to the broader consequences such a confrontation could unleash. Beyond missiles and naval maneuvers lies a far more complex battlefield, one involving global economics, energy security, political stability, and the fragile balance of international power. This is why fear is spreading far beyond the Middle East, reaching boardrooms, stock exchanges, and foreign ministries across the world. Energy markets are among the first to react whenever tensions rise near Iran. Even without a single shot fired, the mere presence of U.S. warships close to Iranian waters sends shockwaves through oil prices. Traders understand a simple reality. Any disruption in the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz could instantly choke global energy supplies. This vulnerability turns military tension into economic pressure, affecting fuel prices, inflation, and everyday life far from the conflict zone. For countries heavily dependent on imported energy, the risk is existential. Europe, still struggling with energy insecurity, watches the situation with deep concern. Asian economies, including China, Japan, and South Korea, rely heavily on oil passing through the Gulf. A prolonged crisis would force them to seek alternative supplies at higher costs, triggering economic slowdowns and political backlash at home. Shipping companies are already calculating worst-case scenarios. Insurance premiums for vessels operating near Iranian waters rise sharply during periods of tension. Some companies reroute ships entirely, increasing travel time and costs. These decisions ripple through global supply chains, causing delays and shortages that consumers eventually feel. In this way, the shadow of conflict affects the world long before any battlefield is declared. Meanwhile, financial markets are hypersensitive to every development. A single headline about a near miss at sea or a hostile exchange of words can wipe billions off global stock markets in minutes. Investors hate uncertainty, and few situations are as unpredictable as a potential war between Iran and the United States. This volatility feeds anxiety and reinforces the perception that the world is entering a more unstable era. Beyond economics, the political consequences of escalation would be severe. Governments across the Middle East fear being dragged into a conflict they did not choose. Many regional leaders privately worry that their countries could become targets simply because of their alliances. Publicly, they call for calm. Privately, they prepare for the worst. Israel watches the situation with particular intensity. Iran is viewed as a strategic threat, and any weakening of Iranian power could be seen as advantageous. At the same time, a full-scale war could unleash chaos, empowering militant groups and destabilizing borders. This contradiction makes regional calculations incredibly complex and unpredictable. Turkey, sitting at the crossroads of Europe and the Middle East, fears the spillover effects of another regional conflict. Refugee flows, trade disruptions, and security threats would place immense strain on its already stretched systems. For Ankara, escalation near Iran is not a distant issue. It is a direct national concern. The crisis also exposes deeper cracks in the international system. Institutions designed to prevent conflict appear increasingly powerless. Diplomatic forums issue statements urging restraint, but enforcement mechanisms are weak. This fuels a dangerous perception that global rules apply unevenly and that power, rather than law, determines outcomes. Such beliefs encourage risk-taking and undermine long-term stability. The role of media and information warfare cannot be ignored. Competing narratives flood news cycles and social media, each shaping public opinion in different directions. In Iran, state-controlled outlets emphasize resistance and defiance. In the US, narratives focus on deterrence and protecting global order. In between, misinformation and speculation thrive, making it harder for citizens, and even policymakers, to separate fact from exaggeration. Public opinion itself becomes a strategic factor. Leaders are constrained by how their actions will be perceived at home. In democracies, public resistance to war can limit options. In more centralized systems, leaders may feel pressure to project strength to maintain legitimacy. These internal dynamics often clash with the demands of diplomacy, narrowing the space for compromise. Another dangerous element is the gradual normalization of crisis. As U.S. warships remain near Iran day after day, the extraordinary begins to feel ordinary. This can dull a sense of urgency, making it easier for small incidents to be dismissed until one goes too far. History shows that prolonged tension often ends not with resolution, but with sudden rupture. Military planners on both sides are undoubtedly running simulations, gaming out scenarios ranging from limited skirmishes to full-scale war. Yet simulations cannot capture human error, fear, or emotion. A nervous operator, a misinterpreted signal, or a delayed message can override even the most carefully designed strategies. This human factor is what makes the current moment especially dangerous. The involvement of non-state actors further complicates the picture. Militias and armed groups aligned with Iran do not always operate under tight, centralized control. Their actions could provoke responses that Tehran did not intend, drawing the U.S. into wider confrontation. This diffusion of power makes de-escalation far more difficult, as responsibility becomes blurred. Diplomatic efforts continue quietly, often away from cameras and headlines. Back-channel talks, intermediaries, and indirect messages aim to reduce the risk of miscalculation. These efforts are fragile and easily undermined by public incidents or inflammatory statements. Still, they represent one of the few remaining barriers between tension and tragedy. At its core, this crisis reflects a broader shift in global politics. The post-Cold War era of relative predictability is fading, replaced by a world of competing powers, regional rivalries, and constant pressure points. The standoff near Iran is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a more fractured international order. For ordinary people around the world, the fear is deeply personal. Rising prices, job insecurity, and a sense that global events are spinning out of control create anxiety far removed from naval maps and strategic doctrines. War, even when it seems distant, has a way of reaching into everyday life. As U.S. warships continue their presence near Iran, the world stands at a crossroads. One path leads toward restraint, dialogue, and a fragile but enduring peace. The other leads toward escalation, uncertainty, and consequences that no one can fully predict. The tragedy is that both paths often look the same in the early stages. The question now is not just whether war will happen, but whether the global system still has the capacity to prevent it. In an age of rapid communication and instant reaction, patience and restraint have become rare strategic assets. Whether leaders possess enough of both may determine the fate of this crisis, and perhaps much more. As the crisis surrounding U.S. warships near Iran reaches its most critical stage, the world is no longer just watching events unfold. It is bracing for outcomes that could redefine global stability. This final phase of tension is shaped by one haunting reality. Once escalation begins, controlling it becomes almost impossible. History has shown time and again that wars rarely start with grand declarations. More often, they erupt from moments of misjudgment, fear, and irreversible reactions. At this stage, every movement at sea carries symbolic weight. A routine patrol can be interpreted as preparation for attack. A defensive maneuver can be read as provocation. In such an environment, perception becomes as powerful as reality. Both Washington and Tehran are acutely aware that any sign of weakness could invite pressure, while any show of strength could ignite confrontation. This balance is not just fragile, it is razor-thin. The United States faces a strategic dilemma. On one hand, withdrawing warships could be interpreted as retreat, undermining credibility with allies and emboldening rivals. On the other hand, maintaining a heavy naval presence increases the risk of accidental clashes. American policymakers must calculate not only military outcomes, but political fallout at home and abroad. A war with Iran would not be limited, short, or clean. It would be costly, chaotic, and deeply unpopular. Iran's leadership is equally constrained. Years of sanctions and isolation have hardened its political posture. Iranian leaders have built their legitimacy around resistance and defiance. Backing down under pressure from U.S. warships could weaken their standing domestically and regionally. Yet escalation risks catastrophic damage to Iran's infrastructure, economy, and long-term security. This paradox traps Iran in a strategy of brinkmanship, pushing limits without crossing lines. The fear gripping the international community stems from the absence of clear off-ramps. Diplomatic pathways exist, but they are narrow and fragile. Trust between the US and Iran is minimal, and past agreements have collapsed, leaving scars on both sides. Without confidence that commitments will be honored, compromise feels risky. This is how prolonged standoffs harden into permanent crises. Meanwhile, global institutions struggle to assert relevance. Calls for restraint echo through international forums, but enforcement power is limited. The world is witnessing a reality where major powers increasingly act unilaterally, guided by national interest rather than collective rules. This erosion of international norms makes future crises more likely and more dangerous. Another critical risk lies in escalation beyond intention. Neither the US nor Iran may want full-scale war, but regional dynamics could override their control. Proxy groups, militias, and allied forces operate with varying degrees of autonomy. A single attack by a non-state actor could trigger retaliation, dragging both sides into a broader conflict they did not plan. This chain reaction is one of the greatest fears among military analysts. Cyber warfare adds yet another invisible layer to the crisis. Disruptions to infrastructure, communications, or financial systems could occur without immediate attribution. Such actions blur the line between peace and war, increasing paranoia and suspicion. When nations cannot clearly identify the source of an attack, the temptation to respond aggressively grows stronger. Public psychology also plays a decisive role. Constant exposure to crisis headlines conditions societies to expect conflict. Fear becomes normalized. When war finally breaks out, it often feels less shocking than it should, because people have been mentally preparing for it for so long. This slow emotional erosion lowers resistance to escalation and reduces pressure on leaders to de-escalate. Yet despite all these dangers, history also offers moments of hope. Past confrontations between powerful adversaries have ended without war, not because tensions disappeared, but because restraint prevailed at the last moment. Such outcomes rarely make headlines, but they shape the world just as profoundly. The current standoff near Iran may still follow this path, if decision-makers choose caution over pride. The stakes could not be higher. A war between the United States and Iran would not be confined to naval battles or airstrikes. It would reshape alliances, disrupt global trade, destabilize entire regions, and accelerate the decline of an already fragile international order. The consequences would be felt for decades, long after the last missile is fired. For ordinary people, far removed from warships and strategy rooms, the impact would be immediate and personal. Higher fuel prices, economic uncertainty, political instability, and a growing sense that the world is becoming more dangerous would define daily life. This is why the world fears escalation, not just because of what might happen, but because of how deeply it would affect everyone. As U.S. warships remain close to Iran, the coming days will be decisive. Every signal matters. Every word spoken by leaders matters. The difference between deterrence and disaster may come down to a single choice, a single moment of restraint, or a single act of diplomacy carried out quietly behind the scenes. The world now waits, not with confidence, but with cautious hope that wisdom will outweigh aggression. Because once escalation crosses a certain threshold, there is no rewind, no reset, and no easy exit. Only consequences. And this is why the presence of U.S. warships near Iran has become more than a military issue. It is a test of leadership, judgment, and the global system itself. Whether this chapter ends in restraint or conflict will shape the future far beyond the waters where these ships now sail. This is where the story stands. This is where the world holds its breath. And this is where the script ends. If you found this breakdown informative and eye-opening, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dive analysis on global conflicts and hidden power struggles. Your support helps us keep bringing you the stories shaping the world.